Hello, good morning, good evening, good afternoon from wherever you are located in this world. I bring you greetings from Grow Leafy, and I just want to talk to you about some quick tips on if you're getting started with the garden and you just really want to know where should you place your garden. And this question came up from one of my viewers that had a question, and she's starting out gardening and she was just wondering, how do I get started? What are some tips? And where do I place my garden? And just how do I get started? So that's what we're going to talk about. So I'm going to give you 8 tips that I think that would be very helpful for you if you're starting out in the garden. So you want to consider your location and really the sun. And so in this area right here, as you can see, I have several different pots, different sizes. I have 2 little small ones, and sometimes I have more depending on what I have growing. And then I have 3 large ones. This one, the potatoes have already gone and they died out and they're actually ready to harvest. That's why it's looking like this. But this to me is my sunniest spot. This area is getting way more than 6 hours of sun. You want to make sure that you're getting at least 6 hours of sun for your plants because they really need that to photosynthesize. This area, I would say, is definitely getting at least 6. It's getting 8 and more hours, more than 8 hours of sun right here. Sometimes, depending on the plant, it might be too much sunlight, and sometimes I just have to shift and move things if I'm able to move it, like a grow bag. So you want to consider the sunlight. Now, some plants don't need a lot of sunlight. They just need some partial shade. Your cooler crops, like your brassicas, your lettuce, your kale, your beets, and they don't mind a little bit of shade, okay? They do need still like 6 hours of sun. So too much sun for some of those plants might be too much. And so you really want to consider location. You might want to have some of your plants closer to a more shaded area, and then some plants that just can thrive in full sun, like your peppers and your tomatoes, might do just fine. For example, with this area, there's a tree that's right here, and then I've got this garden enclosure over here, and I've got a pot right here. So I have this exact assembly of where I have lettuce and herb and marigolds planted, but on the other side of my other garden enclosure where there's more sun, it's getting a lot more sun for the rest of the day. And what I've noticed is that the plants in this pot are doing so much better because they're getting more of that shade than on the other side. So that's just a prime example. This is a lettuce plant, and it's just growing a little bit better on this side. The soil, if you come in and look here, the soil is pretty moist, and I don't have to water it that often, but it is pretty moist, even to the touch. And so there's really no need for me to water it. Whereas on the other side, I may have to water it. That's the first one, is considering the sunlight of your location. Next, you want to consider your soil. You want to consider your soil because the soil is very important. That is something that I'm still continually learning, and something that I did not realize how important it was from the beginning, but I was a beginner gardener as well. But if your soil is well, the makeup is well, the structure of your soil is well, your plants will tend to do better, they will be stronger, and they will be less susceptible to diseases. My soil is still in construction. We're still fairly new here. I'm still working on it, but it's getting better each and every year. And I'm always putting in, towards the end of the season or in the fall, I'm always putting in some more organic matter to enrich the soil, and it sits there and it continues to break down until the spring. So for example, over here, I actually just pulled up some crops here, so you're not going to see that much, but this soil, it's fairly loose, but I did have a plant in here, like I mentioned. But this was a mixture of compost. I actually started this bed with some peat moss. It's fairly loose, but like I mentioned, I had a plant in here. And then let me show you another bed. Oh, let me take that out. Don't want that in there. And over here, I had another plant over here. But if I were to dig deep into the soil, it's a little bit dry on top. It's very moist. It's still kind of moist. I haven't watered this area in a while because I don't really have anything in here. But this soil is a mixture of peat moss, vermiculite, compost. That's how I started it out. And then after that, each year at the end of the season, when I was closing down and putting my beds to rest, I would cover it with leaves and just like about this much of leaves, 2-3 inches of leaves. And then when spring came back around, I would just pull that back. If you're just starting out, you might want to start with a very small garden. It might be very much recommended that I would do that than starting so big, because it can become overwhelming. And so if you start small, then you may be able to just buy some bags and instead of having to mix your own. But sometimes for me, I found it to be less expensive to get peat moss, vermiculite, and compost and mix that all together. But I even started composting myself so that I'm buying and purchasing less compost. So you really want to consider your soil. Come this way. I'm really growing in my raised beds because when I moved here, I knew that I had clay soil, and I knew in some spots there are rocks, in some spots there were so many trees that there were roots. And so I want to grow in raised beds because I really want to be able to just have a little bit more control over the soil makeup. But I would also like to really improve my soil. So there are a couple of plants that I did start last year growing in the soil and just kind of like testing out the soil and see how it will work, are tomato plants. So I have just 2 tomato plants that are here, and I actually dug up a big area. It's like a hole that's in there, and I filled it and mixed it with the makeup that I was talking about, like some soil and compost and vermiculite, my whole soil mixture, and I mixed it all up and I planted these tomato plants. Last year I did have a pretty good harvest with my tomato plants, a very tiny tomato plant that was growing. They're called I'm trying to remember currant tomatoes, something like that, but this time I'm growing some cherry tomatoes and crimson tomatoes. So it's doing well and it's working. But you've got to understand what you're dealing with in your soil, whether you have clay soil, whether you have rocks, whether you have trees. You have to consider all of that. You want to find a spot where you're having less obstructions, less interruptions into the soil so that you really can work all these other ingredients in so you can improve the health of your soil. Consider getting a pH test as well, pH and testing your soil. That will give you a much more clear understanding of with what amendments are needed, what minerals and nutrients are already in your soil or lacking. And so I really have tested my raised beds. I still have not really gotten into the soil, direct soil here in the ground, but I will be because I'm going to be planting trees. And so I know that's the next step that I really need to work on, is improving my clay soil, because it is really tough and it gets really hard. But you want to test your soil so you know what you're dealing with in advance, and then once you find out, then you can apply any amendments that is needed to enrich and make your soil better and stronger. Number 3 is consider accessibility. You want a garden located in a place that's accessible, that you're going to want to go to every day. If it's too far, you may not feel like going there. If it's out of sight, then it's out of mind, it's out of care. You're not going to care for it. You want to have your watering system or whatever it is that you're using in close proximity to the garden, so that when you're watering, you don't have to go too far and it's not too much of a stretch, so that you're encouraged to water your garden. I have a couple of hoses. This is a retractable hose. I love it. So it goes very far. Look at this. It just winds right back, but it's very accessible, so I can take it all over. Initially, my hose was far from my garden. I had to pull that all the way out, and it wasn't long enough, and it really made it a pain when it came to watering. So I installed this because I knew it was closer, and I wanted to come out here and enjoy watering my garden. So you really want to consider accessibility. You also want to make sure that there's no large obstructions that are around that are going to get into the way. You want to be able to harvest easier. Let's go inside my raised bed so you can see into my garden instructions. If you notice in these pathways, there's enough space in between. It's about 3 foot wide, okay? And then between each bed, there's about 2 feet. That way I can get around it, get to the back. It's accessible for me to get around. You want to be able to get all the way around your plants so that you are able to trim when needed, cut when needed, harvest when needed. For example, look at this. I want to be able to access these things very easily. And the same is back here. I want to be able to come back here and reach. And especially if you have a bad back, that can be painful to continually lean over and do that. So you want to make it easy and accessible so that you will enjoy gardening. Now here, reaching back there, for me, I've got short arms. I'm not a very tall person. For me to get to that bush bean and the tomato plants is very difficult. I can't reach back here. Now I want to reach in between, but now these beans are growing up here, so it's kind of tricky. Sometimes I use an extender, and I can't remember what it's called. I'll post the word up right here. But it's like, have you ever seen people walk around in the neighborhoods picking up garbage with that extender? It's an extended hand. Well, I use that a lot in gardening because I don't want to continually always bend over because it hurts my back. And so I will use that extender to weed. Okay, and that makes it very accessible for me. My garden hose extends out very long, so I'm not bending over, making it more accessible. So when you're considering watering your garden and building a garden, make sure that as many aspects of your gardening is very accessible. Number 5 is size of your garden. Consider the size of it and what you are going to be able to maintain. When I first started gardening, here's a picture of the garden. It was too big for me to maintain because, first of all, I didn't know what I was doing. And it looks like it was about 10 by 10 size, 6 by 10 feet size garden. And I did it all wrong. Nothing grew besides what my neighbor gave me, okay? So that just lets you know I truly did not have a green thumb and I was very inexperienced. But it was still small enough for me to learn. But it was still too big for me. I really probably should have started in a pot or something very small. Let me show you a smaller size if you really want to start small and start simple. And then each year you just continually build and build from that. And then you build to the point where you're very comfortable with a larger size. So this little thing right here is, I got to remember, I think it's like 3 by 4, maybe 3 by 3. No, 4 by 2. It's small. I can't remember. I'll put the size up once I remember, but I think it's like 4 by 2. So this is actually a good size. This would have been a good size for me to start out in. And I could have just put maybe two, maybe 3 different plants that I knew could grow in a size like that. That is something that I recommend, is that you start small. Don't start large, but you might start small. One year you have that. And then the next year you have, look over there, a couple of grow bags. And then you might decide, I like the idea of grow bags. Let me get a larger growing container right over here. There's a larger growing container. What I realized is that I loved gardening. I enjoyed it and I wanted more. So I was ready to build something larger. And so we did move. We decided that we want to get more yard space. And so the first structure we put in is actually right over here. And they're both the same size, these 2 garden enclosures. They are 10 by 20 feet garden size. And as you can see, I have 6 raised beds in here. 6 of them, I have pots. And then I was able to manage that for a couple of years. And then I was ready to extend. And that's how we ended up building this one. And so now I'm managing all of that. So next year, if I decide to even grow it even larger, I just need to take it in small increments because I need to be able to manage. The watering system needs to be accessible. It needs to be easier, so I'm not spending hours just watering. So I'm spending a lot of time watering right now, but I'm working on it. So that's another tip. You just want to start simple and then grow from that, bigger and bigger, until you're most comfortable with it, but don't overwhelm yourself. Number 6 is check the leveling of your land. That is really important and is key because it really does affect erosion, which I do have in some areas, it also affects the way the water runs and drains when you're watering, because you want the water to stay there and moisten the soil and feed your plants. But if your water just drains out and washes out, then the plants are not uptaking that, and that's a problem. So you want to make sure that it is leveled. We did take the time to level. Now, it's not leveled 100%. There are some areas that have still a slightly slope. And if it does drain out, it drains out a little, but the plants do still uptake the water. So this is on a slope, but we did have to take a tiller and we tilled the heck out of this thing to get it leveled. And we did the exact same thing on this side. We had to do a lot more leveling on this side because the slope was even steeper. But that is something that you definitely need to consider, is if you live on a slope or if your garden's going to be on any kind of sloped area, you want to get it somewhat leveled. Like I mentioned, it may not be 100%, but leveled enough so that your plants are able to uptake the water. Number 7 is you want to make sure that you're not running into any obstructions that are underground as well, especially when you start digging into the ground and you're tilling up the land, or you're planning on planting trees and starting that, or anything that's going to be digging deep into the ground, because you might run into utility lines, piping from your house. For example, over here would not be a good idea. Look down here. This would not be a good place for me to start gardening, because I have this PVC pipe that's draining water out of the house. I would not want to plant around here, but not even up through this whole area right here, because that place leading all the way up to our home, that's where the piping is coming from. So you just want to make sure that you're knowing exactly where your piping is. Look, there's a rock there, and then there's another place where there's a rock. I also would not plant over here because look, there are rocks. That would be a problem. Here's my last tip, and I'm going to give you a few other tips after this. But number 8 tip is consider your climate, okay? If there are certain crops that you know does not grow in your zone, don't grow it in your zone unless you have, sorry, there's mosquitoes out, unless you have a greenhouse that heats up to the temperature that it needs to be able to grow your plants. For example, I'm in zone 6, so I know I cannot grow tropical plants. I would love to grow bananas and mangoes and oranges, but it's just not realistic in my environment in zone 6. But kale, tomatoes, peppers, brassicas, they do really well. Apples, trees, and that's why I'm going to be getting into some other fruit trees eventually. But you got to consider your climate in the zone that you're in. If you are in a greenhouse or you decide to plant in your house some tropical plants, then have fun with that, with controlling your environment. But if you're planting outdoors, definitely consider what plants best in your zone. And also the native plants do even better because they are acclimated for your zone. So those are my 8 tips that I want to give you. Then here are just a couple of other tips I want to leave with you for today. Get connected with a community support of fellow gardeners. Gardening can sometimes be very alone because it's you and your backyard, your patio, your pots, and it's you trying to figure out these things. And if you're a new gardener, that really helped support me tremendously when I was able to ask questions to other gardeners that may have been a step ahead. So get connected with a community. There's a lot of communities online. You can watch my videos, subscribe to my channel, visit my Facebook page. I have a lot of engagement over there with other fellow gardeners. Ask questions. In your community, there are different community groups that have other fellow gardeners that are trying to do the same thing, and they are excited. And you don't want to go through this alone because there are so many other people that are doing this. I hope that these tips helped. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope there was something that I shared that really would help you as a beginner gardener. But just remember, I'm here if you have any questions and here to support you as well. But remember to grow leafy, and I will see you all next time. Bye.